Case 1. Lois Jurgens. The White Bear Lake case that changed everything. April 11, 1965. Spring arrived late in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, in 1965. The snow was melting, revealing lawns and driveways that had been buried for months. Families were planning Easter celebrations. Children were playing outside again. Life was returning to normal after another brutal Minnesota winter. But inside one house on a quiet, respectable street, something terrible was happening. And on April 11th, it reached its devastating conclusion. Dennis Craig Jurgens was 3 years old. He had curly hair and bright eyes and the kind of energy that makes 3-year-olds both delightful and exhausting. But Dennis wasn't born into the Jurgens family. He had been adopted, placed with Harold and Lois Jurgens through the proper channels, vetted and approved by social workers who believed this would be a good home for him. They were catastrophically wrong. On that April morning, Harold Jurgens made a phone call to authorities. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. Dennis was deceased, he reported. The boy had fallen down the stairs. A tragic accident. Nothing suspicious. But Dr. Roy Peterson, the Ramsey County coroner who examined Dennis's small body, immediately recognized that this was no accident. What he saw shocked him, even after years of performing autopsies and examining victims. Dennis's body was covered in injuries, bruises in various stages of healing, indicating repeated episodes of physical force over an extended period. The pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall. Medical evidence suggested systematic physical mistreatment over months. Dr. Peterson made his determination clear in his report. This was not an accident. This was homicide. The case should have been straightforward from that point. A medical examiner had ruled the death a murder. The child had been in the exclusive care of his adoptive parents. An investigation should have followed immediately, leading to charges and prosecution. Instead, something inexplicable happened. The case was closed, filed away, forgotten. Why? Because in 1965, people couldn't fathom that a church-going woman, a respected member of the community, could be capable of such acts. Lois Jurgens and her husband attended services regularly. They appeared stable and responsible. The idea that such a person could harm a child seemed impossible to authorities at the time. But Dennis wasn't Lois's only victim. The Jurgens family had adopted another boy named Robert, and neighbors had noticed concerning things over the months and years. They had seen Dennis with unexplained injuries. They had heard unusual sounds coming from the house. Some had even expressed concerns to authorities. One neighbor, Donna Marlene Norton, had directly confronted Lois about the way she treated Dennis. She had witnessed troubling behavior and tried to intervene. She even filed reports with the appropriate agencies. But every report was dismissed. Every concern was explained away. Lois always had an answer. Boys are rough. He's clumsy. He's a difficult child. And people accepted these explanations because they wanted to believe them. Dennis was buried. The case file gathered dust. And Lois Jurgens continued her life, attending church, maintaining her respectable image, hiding her true nature behind a facade of normalcy. But some people couldn't let it go. Detective Lieutenant Jerome Zerwas kept the case in the back of his mind. Reporter Paul Grussendorf of the St. Paul Pioneer Press began asking questions. And in 1980, 15 years after Dennis's death, they decided to reinvestigate. What they uncovered was damning. They found the original coroner's report that had been buried. They located witnesses who had tried to report the mistreatment but were ignored. They discovered a pattern of systemic failure that had allowed a child's death to go unpunished for over a decade. They also learned more details about the mistreatment Dennis had endured. Lois had used extreme disciplinary methods that went far beyond normal parenting. She had isolated Dennis, restricted his food, and subjected him to punishments that no child should ever experience. The renewed investigation generated media attention. The story spread beyond Minnesota. People across the country were horrified to learn that a child had been killed, a medical examiner had ruled it murder, and nothing had been done for 15 years. Public pressure mounted. The case was reopened officially. And in 1987, 22 years after Dennis's death, Lois Jurgens finally stood trial for his murder. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the region covered every moment. Prosecutors presented the medical evidence, the witness testimony, the pattern of mistreatment that had led to Dennis's death. Harold Jurgens testified against his wife, admitting that he had known about the mistreatment but had failed to stop it. His testimony painted a picture of a household where one child was terrorized while another was treated normally, where punishments were severe and frequent, where a small boy lived in constant fear. Medical experts explained the injuries in detail, making it clear that Dennis's death was the culmination of months or years of physical mistreatment, not a single incident or accident. The defense attempted to argue that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible, that witnesses' memories had faded, that evidence had been lost. But the medical evidence was still powerful, and the witnesses who testified had never forgotten what they had seen. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict: guilty of third-degree murder. Lois Jurgens was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It seemed like justice had finally been served, albeit decades too late. But Lois served only 8 years before being paroled in 1995. She lived as a free woman for nearly 2 more decades, passing away in 2013 at the age of 87. Dennis Craig Jurgens remained forever 3 years old. The case had profound impacts on Minnesota and beyond. It exposed fatal flaws in the child welfare system and led to significant reforms in how agencies investigate and respond to reports of child mistreatment. It became the subject of a book by Barry Siegel titled A Death in White Bear Lake and was adapted into a television movie. Most importantly, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that certain people who appear respectable, who attend church, who seem normal, are incapable of harming children. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, protected by our unwillingness to see it. Dennis deserved better. He deserved a system that listened to the neighbors who tried to help him. He deserved a justice system that acted on the medical examiner's findings. He deserved parents who would love and protect him. Instead, he suffered and died, and his death was ignored for over 2 decades while his killer lived freely in the community. The White Bear Lake case changed how we think about child protection, about investigating suspicious deaths, about listening to concerned neighbors and medical professionals. Those changes came too late for Dennis, but they may have saved other children in the years since. That's the only consolation in a case with no happy ending. The hope that Dennis's suffering led to reforms that prevented other children from experiencing the same fate. If you believe Dennis's story matters, if you think these reforms were necessary, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell the stories that demand change and honor victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 2. Khoua Her, the unimaginable tragedy. September and October, 1997. Some cases defy comprehension. Some crimes are so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior that our minds struggle to process them. The case of Khoua Her is one of those. In the fall of 1997, in a Minnesota community, 6 children lost their lives. Not in a fire. Not in an accident. Not from illness. 6 children passed away over the course of 2 months at the hands of the woman who had given birth to them. 6 lives. 6 futures. All ended by their own mother. Minnesota's Hmong community had grown significantly in the decades following the end of the Vietnam War. Hmong refugees, who had aided American forces during the conflict, were resettled in various parts of the United States, with significant populations establishing themselves in Minnesota. They brought rich cultural traditions, strong family values, and tight-knit community structures. But within that community, behind closed doors where outsiders rarely looked, Khoua Her was experiencing something dark that no one around her could see or understand. The exact circumstances of how each child passed away remain somewhat unclear in the public record, with various sources suggesting different methods. What remains absolutely clear and undisputed is the horrifying fact that 6 children, 6 separate individuals with their own personalities, their own potential, their own right to life, all perished under their mother's care during those 2 terrible months. How does a mother harm one child, let alone 6? What kind of psychological break? What kind of mental collapse? What kind of darkness takes hold of someone capable of such repeated acts? Psychologists and investigators who worked on the case struggled to understand Khoua Her's mental state during this period. Some experts suggested she may have been experiencing severe psychological distress that went unrecognized and untreated. Others pointed to the possibility of serious mental illness that manifested in the most tragic way imaginable. There were questions about whether cultural barriers had prevented her from seeking or receiving mental health support. There were questions about whether family or community members had noticed warning signs but hadn't known how to intervene. There were questions about whether the American mental health system was equipped to serve immigrant populations dealing with trauma and adjustment challenges. But questions don't bring back 6 children. Explanations don't restore 6 lives. The investigation revealed a timeline that stretched across 2 months, September and October of 1997. During this period, 6 children in one family passed away, one after another. At some point, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Authorities were called. An investigation was launched. When multiple children in the same family pass away in a short period, medical examiners and investigators follow strict protocols. They look for environmental factors, carbon monoxide, toxic substances, disease. They examine each child's medical history. They interview family members extensively. They conduct thorough autopsies. In this case, the evidence pointed to one conclusion. These were not natural deaths. These were not accidents. These children had been intentionally harmed by their mother. Khoua Her was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The legal proceedings that followed were emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The Hmong community grieved publicly. Family members struggled to comprehend what had happened. Mental health professionals attempted to explain the unexplainable. The prosecution's case was built on medical evidence, timeline analysis, and the simple, devastating fact that 6 children had been alive and healthy, and then they were gone, all having passed away under their mother's care with no other plausible explanation for their deaths. The defense attempted to present evidence of Khoua Her's mental state, arguing that she had been experiencing severe psychological distress that impaired her judgment and actions. Expert witnesses testified about various mental health conditions that can affect new mothers and about the unique stressors faced by immigrant women trying to navigate unfamiliar systems while dealing with trauma. But ultimately, the jury had to decide whether Khoua Her was responsible for the deaths of her 6 children. The evidence was overwhelming. The timeline was clear. The medical findings were conclusive. The verdict came back, guilty on multiple counts of murder. Khoua Her was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring she would never have the opportunity to harm another child. But that sentence couldn't restore the 6 lives that had been taken. It couldn't give those children the chance to grow up, go to school, make friends, fall in love, have families of their own. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Minnesota's Hmong community engaged in deep reflection about mental health, about supporting families in crisis, about recognizing warning signs. Community leaders worked with mental health organizations to develop culturally appropriate services and outreach programs. The case also led to changes in how authorities investigate multiple child deaths in the same family. Protocols were strengthened. Training was enhanced. The assumption that multiple deaths must be coincidental was replaced with more rigorous investigation standards. These reforms came from the ashes of tragedy, from 6 children who deserved so much better than the fate they received. The Khoua Her case remains one of the most difficult to discuss in Minnesota criminal history because it forces us to confront the reality that maternal instinct, that supposedly universal, unbreakable bond between mother and child, is not actually universal. It can be broken. It can be absent. It can be overcome by mental illness or darkness or something we may never fully understand. 6 children are gone. 6 graves mark their brief time on earth, and their mother will spend the rest of her life in prison, a sentence that is both just and inadequate, because no punishment can balance the scales when 6 innocent lives have been taken. This case is incredibly difficult to process, but it's important that we remember these 6 children and work to prevent such tragedies in the future. If you think mental health services and community support systems matter, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Case 3, Jennifer Lynn Matter, Secrets in the Mississippi, 1999 and 2003. The Mississippi River flows through the heart of America, carrying water from Minnesota all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a river of commerce and history, of beauty and power. But sometimes, the Mississippi also carries secrets, dark secrets that people hope will be swept away and never found. Jennifer Lynn Matter tried to hide her secrets in the Mississippi. But rivers, eventually, give up what they hold. In 1999, someone discovered a tragic find along the banks of the Mississippi River in Minnesota. An infant had been found, a tiny life that had ended before it really began. The discovery shocked the local community and launched an investigation. But without modern DNA technology being widely available or as advanced as it is today, without witnesses, without any clear leads, the case went cold. The infant was given a respectful burial, but their identity and the circumstances of their death remained a mystery. Investigators could only speculate about what had happened. For years past, the case remained unsolved, filed away among other tragic mysteries that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. Then, in 2003, history repeated itself in the most disturbing way. Another infant was discovered near the Mississippi River. Another young life had been discarded and abandoned. This time, however, forensic technology had advanced significantly. DNA collection and analysis had become more sophisticated and more widely used. Investigators carefully processed the scene, collected biological samples, and preserved evidence with the hope that science would eventually provide answers. They also made a decision to revisit the 1999 case, collecting and analyzing DNA from that earlier discovery. When the results came back, they revealed a stunning connection. Both infants shared the same biological mother. This was no longer a single tragic incident or unfortunate coincidence. This was a pattern. Somewhere, there was a woman who had given birth at least twice and had disposed of both infants in or near the Mississippi River. Investigators began the painstaking work of trying to identify the mother. They searched missing persons databases. They reviewed hospital records. They looked for any woman who might have been pregnant during the relevant time periods, but had no children to show for it. The breakthrough came through DNA databases and investigative genealogy, techniques that were becoming increasingly powerful tools in solving cold cases. By analyzing the genetic profiles of the infants and comparing them to reference databases, investigators were eventually able to identify their biological mother, Jennifer Lynn Matter. When Jennifer was located and confronted with the evidence, she couldn't deny the scientific facts. The DNA didn't lie. Those were her children, and she had disposed of their bodies in or near the Mississippi River. The investigation into Jennifer's background revealed disturbing information. She had carried both pregnancies without telling anyone. She had given birth alone, without medical supervision or assistance. And then she had made the calculated decision to dispose of the newborns rather than seek help or surrender them through legal channels. How does someone hide two pregnancies? How does someone give birth alone, twice, and then dispose of their newborns without anyone noticing? The answers lie in isolation, secrecy, and careful planning. Jennifer had deliberately concealed her condition both times. She had avoided situations where her pregnancy might be noticed. She had prepared to give birth alone, and she had known where she would dispose of the evidence. This wasn't impulse or panic. This was premeditation and calculation. Prosecutors charged Jennifer Lynn Matter with 2 counts of murder. The defense attempted to argue various mitigating factors: mental health issues, fear of social stigma, panic during and after birth. They brought in experts to testify about neonaticide, the term for killing a newborn within the first 24 hours of life, and the psychological factors that can contribute to such acts. But the prosecution countered that Jennifer's actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt and planning. She hadn't had mental health episodes that led to impulsive acts. She had hidden her pregnancies, given birth alone, and disposed of the evidence. She had done this twice, with years in between, suggesting this was her method for dealing with unwanted pregnancies. The trial included testimony from medical examiners about the infant's causes of death, from forensic experts about the DNA evidence, and from investigators about how they had finally connected these 2 cold cases to Jennifer Matter. The jury heard all the evidence and reached their verdict: guilty on both counts. Jennifer Lynn Matter was sentenced to decades in prison. She would spend much of her remaining life behind bars, paying the price for taking 2 innocent lives and attempting to hide her crimes in the waters of the Mississippi River. But the sentence, while just, couldn't restore what had been lost. 2 children who deserved names, birthdays, and futures had instead been discarded like they were nothing. They had been denied the most basic right, the right to live. The Jennifer Lynn Matter case highlighted the critical importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases. Without advances in genetic testing and analysis, These two infants might have remained unidentified forever, and their mother might never have been held accountable. The case also became part of larger conversations about safe haven laws. Minnesota, like all states, has legislation that allows parents to legally surrender newborns at designated locations, hospitals, fire stations, police stations, without fear of prosecution. These laws exist specifically to prevent tragedies like the ones Jennifer Matter caused. Jennifer had options. She could have surrendered her babies safely and legally. She could have placed them for adoption. She could have sought help from family, friends, or social services. Instead, she chose to end their lives and hide the evidence. That choice made her a criminal and made those infants victims whose stories needed to be told. The Mississippi River continues to flow through Minnesota, carrying water and history toward the Gulf of Mexico. But it no longer carries the secrets of two unnamed infants. Their story has been told. Their mother has been brought to justice, and their brief existence has been acknowledged and honored. Sometimes justice takes years or even decades. Sometimes it requires technology that didn't exist when crimes were committed. But when justice finally arrives, it matters profoundly. If you believe DNA technology and persistent investigators deserve recognition, if these infants deserve to be remembered, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Cold cases can be solved, but only with dedication and advancing science. Case 4. Ashleigh Jennifer Casey, the St. Louis Park Incident. March 30th, 2009. St. Louis Park, Minnesota, sits just west of Minneapolis, a comfortable suburb with tree-lined streets, good schools, and parks where families gather on sunny afternoons. It's the kind of community where people choose to raise children because it feels safe and nurturing. On March 30th, 2009, that sense of safety was shattered when a 3-month-old infant passed away under circumstances that would lead to a criminal investigation and eventually to murder charges. 3 months old, barely past the newborn stage, still tiny and fragile, completely dependent on caregivers for survival. At that age, every moment requires attention. Feeding, changing, comforting, protecting. The infant's mother, Ashleigh Jennifer Casey, called emergency services to report that her baby had stopped breathing. Responders rushed to the scene and attempted resuscitation, but it was too late. The child was gone. Initially, the death appeared to be a tragic case of sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS. SIDS is a heartbreaking reality that claims the lives of seemingly healthy infants without warning or clear cause. It's every parent's nightmare and a source of ongoing medical research. But medical examiners who performed the autopsy on Ashleigh's infant began to see signs that this might not be SIDS. Certain medical indicators suggested this infant had been deprived of oxygen deliberately, not naturally. Investigators reopened what had initially seemed like a closed case. They began examining Ashleigh's background, her mental health history, her circumstances at the time of the infant's death. They interviewed family members and friends. They reviewed medical records and timelines. The evidence began pointing toward a disturbing conclusion. This infant had been intentionally harmed. The method appeared to be asphyxiation, the deliberate blocking of the airways that prevented the baby from breathing. Asphyxiation of infants is particularly difficult to investigate because it leaves minimal physical evidence. There are no wounds, no broken bones, no obvious signs of trauma. Medical examiners must look for subtle indicators and piece together evidence from multiple sources. In Ashleigh's case, the cumulative evidence was sufficient to charge her with murder. Prosecutors believed they could prove that she had deliberately ended her 3-month-old infant's life. The trial explored difficult questions about Ashleigh's mental state at the time. The defense presented evidence suggesting she had been experiencing severe postpartum depression or possibly postpartum psychosis, serious mental health conditions that can affect women after giving birth. Postpartum depression is relatively common, affecting a significant percentage of new mothers. Postpartum psychosis is rarer but much more severe, potentially including delusions, hallucinations, and impaired judgment. Expert witnesses testified about these conditions, explaining how they can affect thinking, behavior, and decision-making. They described how some women experience intrusive thoughts or impulses that are deeply disturbing to them. They explained how, in extreme cases, these conditions can lead to tragic outcomes. But the prosecution argued that even if Ashleigh was experiencing mental health challenges, the evidence suggested she knew what she was doing. The act of asphyxiation requires sustained effort. It's not an impulsive split-second decision. It requires holding something over an infant's airways for an extended period, through the infant's struggles, until life ends. Medical experts testified about the autopsy findings and what they indicated about the cause and manner of death. Investigators described the evidence that had led them to suspect this was not SIDS, but deliberate harm. The jury faced a difficult decision. They had to weigh the evidence of mental illness against the evidence of deliberate action. They had to determine whether Ashleigh Casey had committed murder or whether she had been so impaired by mental illness that she couldn't be held fully responsible. After deliberating, they reached their verdict: guilty. Ashleigh Jennifer Casey was convicted of taking her 3-month-old infant's life. The judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, ensuring she would spend many years behind bars. The conviction brought a measure of justice for the infant who never had the chance to grow up, to experience childhood, to live a full life. But it also highlighted the complex intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility. The case prompted discussions about postpartum mental health screening and support. How can we better identify new mothers who are struggling? How can we provide timely intervention and treatment? How can we prevent tragedies while respecting the reality that mental illness is a legitimate medical condition? These are difficult questions with no simple answers. We want to hold people accountable for their actions, but we also recognize that severe mental illness can impair judgment and behavior in profound ways. What's clear is that the 3-month-old infant in this case deserved better. Deserved a mother who was mentally healthy and capable of providing care. Deserved a support system that recognized warning signs and intervened. Deserved the chance to live. The St. Louis Park community mourned the loss of this young life and grappled with the reality that such tragedies can happen anywhere, even in communities that seem safe and stable. Ashleigh Casey's case serves as a reminder that postpartum mental health is critically important and deserves serious attention from healthcare providers, families, and society at large. But it also reminds us that even mental health struggles don't excuse the taking of innocent life, and accountability matters. That infant deserved protection and care. Instead, the person responsible for providing both took everything away. If you think postpartum mental health deserves more attention and resources, if you believe this infant's brief life mattered, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We cover cases that challenge us to think deeply about justice, responsibility, and prevention. Case 5. Julissa Thaler, the tragic case of Eli Hart. June 29, 2022. Some cases stay with you long after you've learned about them. Some stories are so heartbreaking, so senseless, so filled with suffering that they change how you see the world. The case involving 6-year-old Eli Hart is one of those stories. Summer of 2022 was in full swing in Minnesota. School was out. Kids were playing outside, going to pools and parks, enjoying the warm weather that Minnesotans treasure after long, brutal winters. Life was good for most children in the state. But for Eli Hart, summer 2022 would never come. His life ended on June 29th at the hands of his own mother, Julissa Thaler. Eli wasn't a newborn or an infant. He was 6 years old. He attended school. He had friends and favorite activities. He had a personality, dreams, and a future that should have stretched decades into the distance. He was a real person with thoughts and feelings and the right to grow up. His mother took all of that away from him in an act of violence so extreme that it shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The discovery of Eli's body came during a traffic stop when law enforcement officers conducted a search of Julissa Thaler's vehicle. They had been looking for her in connection with other matters, but what they found was infinitely worse than anything they expected. Eli was found deceased in the vehicle. The circumstances were such that it was immediately clear this was not an accident or a medical emergency. This was deliberate violence. The officers who made this discovery were deeply affected by what they encountered. These were professional investigators who had worked countless cases, but finding a 6-year-old child in these circumstances was traumatic even for them. The investigation revealed that Eli had been harmed in a way that indicated extreme violence. His small body bore evidence of an attack that no child should ever endure. Medical examiners confirmed that the injuries were fatal and had been deliberately inflicted. Julissa Thaler was immediately taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. The case quickly gained media attention across Minnesota and beyond. People were horrified by what had happened to Eli. As investigators dug into the background of the case, they discovered troubling information about Eli's family situation. Julissa had a history of instability, including struggles with substance use and mental health issues. There had been involvement with child protection services. There were concerns that had been documented. Eli's father, Khoua Her, had been fighting for custody of his son. He had raised concerns about Julissa's ability to provide appropriate care. He had documented issues and presented them to courts and social workers. But the family court system is designed to give parents multiple chances and to work toward reunification when possible. Sometimes that approach works. Sometimes it gives struggling parents the support and time they need to get healthy and become capable caregivers. But sometimes, tragically, it gives dangerous people access to vulnerable children. In Eli's case, the system's efforts to work with his mother and give her opportunities to improve the situation ultimately failed to protect him. The concerns his father had raised proved to be tragically justified. The trial of Julissa Thaler was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Photographs of Eli, a smiling, energetic 6-year-old boy full of life, stood in stark contrast to the evidence of how his life had ended. The defense attempted to argue that Julissa was experiencing severe mental health issues and was not fully responsible for her actions. They presented psychiatric evaluations and expert testimony about various mental health conditions. But the prosecution argued that regardless of any mental health challenges, Julissa's actions demonstrated consciousness and deliberation. After Eli's passing, she had continued with her daily activities. She had not immediately contacted authorities or expressed remorse. The evidence suggested she knew what she had done and had tried to conceal it. Medical experts testified about the injuries Eli had sustained and what they indicated about the nature of the attack. The testimony was difficult to hear, painting a picture of extreme violence against a small child who couldn't defend himself. Eli's father and other family members testified about what kind of child he had been, his personality, his interests, his bright spirit. They described their ongoing concerns about his safety and their desperate attempts to protect him through the legal system. The jury heard all the evidence and deliberated on the charges. When they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. Julissa Thaler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, ensuring she could never harm another child. But for Eli, justice came too late. He would never turn 7. Never go to middle school, never experience his first crush, his first job, his first home of his own, never grow up, fall in love, have children. All of those possibilities were erased on June 29, 2022. In the aftermath of Eli's passing, Minnesota once again examined its child protection and family court systems. How had this happened? How had a 6-year-old boy ended up in a situation where his life was taken by his own mother despite documented concerns and an active custody dispute? The answers were complex and systemic. Underfunded child protection agencies. Overworked caseworkers carrying impossibly large caseloads. A legal system that prioritizes parental rights and family reunification. A society that struggles to balance intervention with privacy, protection with family autonomy. These systemic issues didn't excuse what happened to Eli, but they helped explain how warning signs can be missed or inadequately addressed. They highlighted the need for reform, for better funding, for lower caseloads, for more training, for clearer protocols about when to remove children from potentially dangerous situations. Eli Hart's case became a catalyst for conversations about these issues in Minnesota and beyond. Child advocacy organizations used his story to push for reforms. Legislators considered changes to laws and funding. Communities discussed how to better support both struggling families and vulnerable children. But all the reforms in the world couldn't bring Eli back. His father would never hold him again. His extended family would never watch him grow up. His potential would never be realized. The only consolation, and it's a small one, is that Eli's story might help prevent future tragedies. If his case leads to reforms that save even one child's life, then his death will have meaning beyond the terrible loss itself. Eli Hart deserved so much better than the fate he received. He deserved a childhood full of joy and discovery. He deserved parents who would protect and nurture him. He deserved to grow old. Instead, he became another child lost to a system that couldn't protect him and a parent who should have loved him but harmed him instead. If Eli's story breaks your heart, if you believe children deserve better protection from our systems and our society, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell these difficult stories because these children deserve to be remembered and because change only happens when we refuse to look away. Case 6. Jorden Marie Borders, The Hidden Suffering. November 22, 2022 through June 4, 2025. Child maltreatment is often invisible. It happens behind closed doors, in homes that look normal from the outside. Neighbors don't always notice. Teachers might have suspicions, but no proof. And the victims, especially young children, often don't know how to ask for help or are too frightened to try. Jorden Marie Borders committed acts of serious child maltreatment over an extended period, beginning at least as early as November 22, 2022, and continuing until she was finally stopped and held accountable. This wasn't a single incident. This wasn't one terrible mistake made in a moment of stress or anger. This was an ongoing pattern of harmful behavior directed at a child who depended on Jorden for everything: food, shelter, safety, love. The child in this case suffered for years. The exact details of the maltreatment that occurred remain sealed in many court documents to protect the victim's privacy and well-being, which is appropriate and necessary. But what is known is that the maltreatment was serious enough to result in significant criminal charges and ultimately a conviction. The investigation into Jorden Borders likely began when someone, a teacher, a doctor, a neighbor, or another concerned person, reported suspicions to authorities. In Minnesota, certain professionals are mandatory reporters, legally required to contact Child Protection Services if they suspect a child is being harmed. When Child Protection Services and law enforcement got involved and began investigating, they discovered evidence of serious maltreatment. The child showed signs of harm that had occurred over an extended period. Medical examinations likely revealed injuries in various stages of healing, suggesting multiple incidents of harmful behavior. There may have been evidence of neglect as well as active harm, inadequate food, inappropriate living conditions, lack of necessary medical care, or other failures to meet the child's basic needs. Interviews with the child, conducted by specially trained forensic interviewers in child-friendly settings, likely provided crucial information about what had been happening in the home. These interviews are carefully done to protect the child from further trauma while gathering accurate information for the investigation. Jorden Marie Borders was arrested and charged with multiple serious offenses related to child maltreatment. The specific charges reflected the severity and duration of the harm that had been inflicted. As the case moved through the legal system, evidence was presented to prosecutors, who determined that the case was strong enough to proceed to trial. In June of 2025, Jorden stood trial for the charges against her. The trial included testimony from medical experts who explained the nature and extent of the child's injuries and what they indicated about the maltreatment. Child protection workers testified about their investigation and what they had discovered. Other witnesses may have provided information about Jorden's behavior and the child's condition. The defense likely presented mitigating evidence, perhaps information about Jorden's own difficult background, mental health struggles, lack of support systems, or other factors that might have contributed to her harmful behavior. These factors don't excuse maltreatment, but courts do consider them when determining culpability and sentencing. But ultimately, the jury had to decide whether Jorden Borders had committed the acts she was charged with and whether she should be held criminally responsible. The evidence was presented. The witnesses testified. The jury deliberated. Their verdict: guilty on the charges. Jorden Marie Borders was convicted of serious crimes against a child. The judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, ensuring she would be separated from society and unable to harm children for many years. But while justice was served in a legal sense, the child who was the victim in this case will carry the effects of this maltreatment for life. Physical injuries may heal, but emotional and psychological wounds often persist. Trust is broken. Development is affected. The trauma becomes part of who they are. This child will need ongoing support, therapy, medical care, stable placements, adults who can provide consistent love and protection. With proper support, Many children who experience maltreatment can go on to live full, meaningful lives. But they shouldn't have had to overcome such challenges in the first place. The Jorden Borders case highlights critical issues in child protection. Maltreatment often goes undetected for far too long because it's hidden, because warning signs are subtle, because people hesitate to report suspicions. Every state, including Minnesota, has systems in place for reporting suspected child maltreatment. Teachers, doctors, therapists, and other professionals who work with children are mandatory reporters. But really, everyone has a moral obligation to speak up if they see something concerning. If you notice a child with unexplained injuries, who seems fearful or withdrawn, who lacks adequate food or clothing, who talks about being hurt or scared at home, report it. Call your local child protection services. Call law enforcement. You might be wrong. You might be misinterpreting what you've seen. But you might also be saving a child's life or preventing years of suffering. In this case, someone eventually made that call. Someone reported their concerns, and a child was rescued from ongoing maltreatment. It came too late to prevent the harm that had already occurred, but it prevented further harm. And in child protection work, that matters enormously. The child in the Jorden Borders case survived. They're now in a safer situation where they can begin to heal. That's not a happy ending. There is no happy ending when a child has been seriously harmed, but it's better than the alternative. Jorden Borders will spend years in prison reflecting on her actions. The child she harmed will spend years healing from those actions. And hopefully, the case will serve as a reminder to all of us to stay vigilant, to pay attention to the children in our communities, and to speak up when something doesn't seem right. If you believe children deserve protection and that speaking up can save lives, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Awareness and action prevent tragedies. Let's work together to keep children safe. Case 7. Suad Mohamed Ali, the Pelican Rapids Tragedy. July 10, 2023. Pelican Rapids is a small city in western Minnesota with a population of just over 2,000 people. It's the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where serious crime is rare, where children play outside and families feel safe. On July 10, 2023, that sense of safety was shattered when emergency responders were called to a residence where a 3-year-old girl had been found unresponsive. 3 years old, just beginning to develop language skills, to assert independence, to explore the world with boundless curiosity. At that age, children are discovering who they are, testing boundaries, learning about relationships and trust. Suad Mohamed Ali, the child's mother, called for help. Her daughter wasn't breathing. The child needed immediate medical attention. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene and attempted to save the little girl's life, but their efforts were unsuccessful. She had already passed away. At first, it appeared to be a tragic medical emergency. Young children can have sudden health crises that are difficult to predict or prevent. It's every parent's worst nightmare, a healthy child who suddenly becomes ill or injured beyond help. But when medical examiners conducted an autopsy, they made a disturbing discovery. This child's passing was not due to a medical emergency or natural causes. The evidence indicated that she had been deprived of oxygen deliberately. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Someone had intentionally prevented this 3-year-old from breathing. And the only person who had been present was her mother, Suad Mohamed Ali. Investigators from the Pelican Rapids Police Department and the Otter Tail County Sheriff's Office began a thorough investigation. They interviewed Suad extensively. They examined the scene. They reviewed medical records and timelines. They looked for any explanation that might fit the evidence. During these interviews, Suad's account of what had happened changed multiple times. First, she said the child had been sleeping and simply didn't wake up. Then she suggested the child had been ill. Later, she claimed she had left the room briefly and returned to find her daughter unresponsive. But the medical evidence didn't support any of these narratives. The child had been deliberately deprived of oxygen. The method appeared to be asphyxiation, blocking the airways with a hand, a pillow, or some other object. Asphyxiation is a particularly intimate and deliberate method. It requires sustained effort over a period of time. A child doesn't pass away instantly when their air is cut off. They struggle. They resist. And the person causing the harm must maintain that pressure through the child's struggles until life ends. This isn't something that happens in a split second of anger or frustration. This requires conscious, sustained action. Prosecutors in Ottertail County charged Suad Mohamed Ali with second-degree murder. The charge reflected their belief that she had deliberately taken her daughter's life, even if there might have been some level of mental distress or other factors that prevented them from charging first-degree murder. As the case proceeded through the legal system, more information emerged about Suad's circumstances. She was part of the Somali immigrant community in Minnesota, one of many families who had come to the United States seeking better opportunities and safety. But immigration and cultural adjustment can be enormously stressful. Language barriers, cultural differences, isolation from extended family and familiar support systems, economic pressures. All of these factors can create immense strain on families. The defense likely presented evidence about these challenges, arguing that Suad had been struggling with depression, cultural isolation, and stress that had impaired her judgment and contributed to her actions. Expert witnesses may have testified about the unique pressures faced by immigrant mothers, about mental health conditions that can affect people who have experienced displacement and trauma, about the difficulty of navigating American systems while maintaining cultural identity. But the prosecution maintained that while these challenges are real and deserving of sympathy, they don't excuse taking a child's life. Thousands of immigrant mothers in Minnesota face similar struggles. They cope with language barriers, cultural adjustment, economic pressures, and isolation. The vast majority of them do not harm their children. Suad Mohamed Ali had options. Minnesota has robust support systems for immigrant families, including culturally specific organizations that provide assistance, interpretation services, mental health resources, and community support. She could have reached out to these organizations. She could have asked for help. Instead, the evidence indicated that she had taken her 3-year-old daughter's life. The trial proceeded with testimony from medical examiners about the autopsy findings, from investigators about the investigation and Suad's inconsistent statements, and from experts about various aspects of the case. The jury deliberated and reached their verdict: guilty. Suad Mohamed Ali was convicted of taking her 3-year-old daughter's life. The judge sentenced her to a significant prison term, ensuring she would spend many years behind bars. But the conviction couldn't restore the little girl who had passed away. It couldn't give her back the childhood she deserved, the adolescence she would never experience, the adulthood she would never reach. The case prompted important conversations in Pelican Rapids and across Minnesota about support for immigrant families, about mental health resources in rural communities, about early intervention and prevention. These conversations are valuable and necessary. We should be working to ensure that every family, regardless of cultural background or geographic location, has access to the support and resources they need. We should be reducing barriers to mental health care. We should be building stronger community connections that can identify struggling families and provide help before crisis occurs. But we also need to maintain clear accountability when children are harmed. Understanding contributing factors doesn't mean excusing harmful actions. Both things can be true simultaneously. We can recognize that someone was struggling while also holding them responsible for their choices. The 3-year-old girl who passed away in Pelican Rapids on July 10, 2023, deserved better. She deserved a mother who would protect her. She deserved to grow up in safety. She deserved a full life. Her mother took all of that away from her. And while Suad Mohamed Ali will eventually be released from prison and have the opportunity to rebuild her life, her daughter will remain forever 3 years old. If you believe immigrant families deserve comprehensive support systems and that every child deserves protection regardless of their background, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These cases demand both compassion and accountability. Case 8. Jennifer Marie Stately, the Cass Lake Devastation. March 27, 2024. Cass Lake, Minnesota, is located on the Leech Lake Indian Reservation in north-central Minnesota. It's a community with deep cultural roots, strong traditions, and close family bonds. Like many reservation communities, it also faces significant challenges including poverty, limited resources, and historical trauma. On March 27, 2024, Cass Lake experienced one of the darkest days in its history. 2 children passed away in a residence, and their mother, Jennifer Marie Stately, was arrested and charged with their murders. The circumstances of that day were horrifying. Emergency responders arrived at the scene to find that 2 children had passed away under violent circumstances. There was also evidence of arson. Someone had set fire to the residence, apparently in an attempt to destroy evidence. Jennifer Marie Stately was the children's mother and the only adult present. The evidence immediately pointed to her involvement. Investigators from multiple agencies, tribal police, county sheriffs, state investigators, and federal agents, due to the reservation location, descended on Cass Lake to process the scene and build a case. The investigation had to proceed carefully. The scene was complex, involving both a double homicide and arson. Physical evidence had to be collected and preserved despite fire damage. Autopsies had to be performed to determine exactly how the children had passed away. Witnesses had to be interviewed. The specific methods by which the children passed away were not fully released to the public, which is common in cases involving child victims. Investigators and prosecutors often withhold certain details to protect the integrity of the investigation and to spare the community from the most graphic elements of the crime. But what is known is that 2 children lost their lives violently, and then their mother attempted to burn down the house with their bodies inside. Arson adds a calculated element to already horrific crimes. It suggests awareness of wrongdoing and an attempt to cover up evidence. It indicates that Jennifer knew what she had done was criminal and was trying to avoid consequences. Firefighters were able to extinguish the blaze before the entire structure was destroyed, which allowed investigators to recover crucial evidence. But the damage was extensive, making the investigation more challenging. Jennifer Marie Stately was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and arson. If convicted, she would face the possibility of life in prison. The Cass Lake community was devastated. Tribal leaders held community meetings. Vigils were organized for the children. Families grieved together, trying to process how something so terrible could happen in their community. The case also highlighted systemic issues that affect many Native American communities. Historical trauma from colonization, forced assimilation, and broken treaties continues to impact families generations later. Poverty rates on many reservations are significantly higher than national averages. Access to mental health services is often limited. Substance use disorders affect many families. These factors don't excuse violence, but they provide context for understanding the challenges that families on reservations face. They also point to the need for better resources, more funding, and sustained support for Native communities. During Jennifer's legal proceedings, her defense team likely presented evidence about her mental state, her personal history, and the systemic factors that had affected her life. They may have argued that she was experiencing severe mental health issues at the time of the crimes, that she had been affected by generational trauma, or that she had limited access to the support she needed. The prosecution, however, had to focus on what Jennifer had done. 2 children were gone. The evidence showed they had been harmed deliberately. A fire had been set in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Regardless of contributing factors, Jennifer had made choices that resulted in 2 deaths. The trial process moved forward with testimony from medical examiners, arson investigators, law enforcement officers, and possibly mental health experts. Physical evidence was presented. The timeline was established. Family members likely testified about the children and the impact of their loss. 2 children who should have had full lives ahead of them were gone. 2 sets of dreams and possibilities were erased. 2 young people who were connected to their tribal community, who had family who loved them, who deserved protection and care. They were taken away far too soon. Jennifer Marie Stately's conviction meant she would spend a significant portion or possibly all of her remaining life in prison. But that consequence, while just, couldn't restore what had been lost. The case became part of larger conversations about child welfare in Native American communities. The Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, federal legislation designed to keep Native children connected to their tribes and cultures, provides important protections. But those protections only work effectively if families and communities have adequate resources to support struggling parents before tragedy occurs. Tribal leaders and child welfare advocates have worked to strengthen support systems, to improve coordination between tribal, state, and federal agencies, and to ensure that Native families have access to culturally appropriate services. These efforts are crucial. They won't bring back the 2 children who passed away in Cass Lake on March 27, 2024, but they might prevent future tragedies. They might save other children. They might give other struggling parents the help they need before crisis becomes catastrophe. The Leech Lake community will carry the weight of this tragedy for generations. But communities are resilient. They grieve, they heal, they work to prevent future suffering, and they honor the memory of those they've lost. If you believe Native American communities deserve equitable resources and support, if you think these two children deserve to live and thrive, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories matter. These victims deserve to be remembered. Case 9. Larena Jackson, the second Cass Lake tragedy. March 27, 2024. The fact that two separate child deaths occurred in Cass Lake on the same day is almost incomprehensible. March 27, 2024, will be remembered as one of the darkest days in the community's history. While Jennifer Marie Stately's case involved multiple children and arson, Larena Jackson's case involved the death of her toddler under circumstances that led to murder charges. The details of exactly what happened in Larena Jackson's case are distinct from the Stately case, though both occurred in the same small community on the same tragic day. The toddler in Larena's care passed away under circumstances that immediately raised concerns among medical personnel and investigators. When a young child passes away unexpectedly, medical examiners follow strict protocols. They conduct thorough autopsies. They look for signs of disease, accident, or intentional harm. They document every finding meticulously. In this case, the autopsy revealed that the toddler's passing was not from natural causes or accident. The injuries and evidence indicated that the child had been deliberately harmed. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Investigators focused on Larena Jackson as the primary suspect. She had been the child's primary caregiver. She had been present when the child passed away, and her explanations for what had happened didn't match the physical evidence that medical examiners had documented. As investigators built their case, evidence accumulated that pointed to Larena's guilt. The nature of the injuries, the timeline of events, witness statements, and Larena's own inconsistent accounts all contributed to the decision to charge her with murder. Larena Jackson was arrested and formally charged. As the case moved through the legal system, something significant happened. Larena decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder rather than take the case to trial. A guilty plea can occur for several reasons. Sometimes the evidence is so overwhelming that a defendant and their attorney recognize that conviction at trial is virtually certain, and pleading guilty allows for the possibility of a somewhat reduced sentence. Sometimes defendants feel genuine remorse and want to take responsibility for their actions. Sometimes plea agreements are negotiated where prosecutors agree to reduce charges or recommend a particular sentence in exchange for avoiding a trial. We don't know the specific circumstances that led to Larena Jackson's guilty plea. What we know is that she stood in court and admitted, on the record, that she had caused her toddler's death and was guilty of second-degree murder. The judge accepted her guilty plea and sentenced her accordingly. Second-degree murder carries serious consequences, typically decades in prison. Larena would not be released anytime soon. She would spend a significant portion of her life behind bars, paying the price for taking her child's life. But her toddler would never get those years, would never experience childhood, adolescence, or adulthood, would never have the opportunities and experiences that make up a full life. The fact that two mothers in the same small community took their children's lives on the same day sent shockwaves far beyond Cass Lake. People struggled to understand what had happened. Was this coincidence? Was there some environmental factor at play? Were both women experiencing similar crises? The answers are complex and probably involve multiple factors. Both women were likely dealing with stress, mental health challenges, and the systemic issues that affect many reservation communities. But causation in human behavior is rarely simple or singular. What is clear is that on March 27, 2024, multiple children in Cass Lake lost their lives at the hands of their own mothers. Multiple families experienced unimaginable loss. An entire community was traumatized. In the aftermath, tribal leaders, mental health professionals, and child welfare advocates came together to examine what had happened and how to prevent similar tragedies. They looked at what warning signs might have been missed, what support systems were lacking, what interventions could have been made earlier. These discussions led to concrete actions. Mental health services on the Leech Lake Reservation were expanded. Additional funding was secured for family support programs. Training was provided to community members on recognizing signs of parental distress and how to offer help. These changes won't bring back the children who passed away, but they represent a commitment to preventing future tragedies, to supporting struggling families before crisis occurs, to protecting vulnerable children. Larena Jackson's guilty plea meant there was no lengthy trial, no extended media coverage of every painful detail. The case was resolved relatively quickly in legal terms. But for the family members who love that toddler, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, the case will never be closed. They will grieve forever. They will wonder what they could have done differently. They will question whether they missed warning signs. They will struggle with anger at Larena, sadness for the child, and confusion about how this happened. These are normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. When someone we know commits an unthinkable act, we struggle to reconcile the person we thought we knew with the person capable of such harm. We search for explanations that make sense of the senseless. The truth is that human behavior is complex. People are capable of both great love and terrible harm, sometimes simultaneously. Mental illness, stress, trauma, and desperation can push people to make choices they never imagined they would make. But understanding contributing factors is different from excusing actions. Larena Jackson made a choice that ended her toddler's life. She is responsible for that choice and is being held accountable through the criminal justice system. The toddler who passed away in Larena Jackson's care deserved better. Deserved a childhood full of play and learning and growth. Deserved parents who would protect and nurture. Deserved a full life with all its possibilities. March 27, 2024, robbed multiple children in Ashleigh of their futures. The community continues to heal, to strengthen its support systems, and to work toward preventing such tragedies from happening again. If you believe reservation communities deserve robust support systems and that every child deserves protection and opportunity, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Awareness leads to action, and action saves lives. Case 10. Valerie Connie Zamora, the Moorhead case. May 2025. Our final case brings us to Moorhead, Minnesota, a city of approximately 40,000 people located on the western edge of the state, directly across the Red River from Fargo, North Dakota. Moorhead is home to Minnesota State University Moorhead and has a diverse, growing population. In May of 2025, 32-year-old Valerie Connie Zamora was charged with second-degree murder following the passing of her 20-month-old son, Jose Lazarus Zamora. 20 months old. Not quite 2 years. Still so young, so vulnerable, so dependent on his mother for everything. Food, comfort, protection, love. At that age, children are learning to walk more steadily, beginning to string words together into simple sentences, developing personalities and preferences. They're becoming little people with their own wills and desires, but they're still babies in so many ways. Jose Lazarus Zamora should have had his whole life ahead of him. Preschool, elementary school, friendships, sports, or music or art or whatever interested him. A first day of kindergarten. Learning to ride a bike. Birthday parties and holidays and all the ordinary joys of childhood. Instead, his life ended at 20 months, and his mother was charged with causing his death. The case came to light when medical professionals who examined Jose determined that his injuries were not consistent with accident or natural causes. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy ruled the manner of death a homicide, meaning that Jose's passing had been caused by another person's actions. When a child's death is ruled a homicide, investigators immediately focus on the people who had access to that child. In Jose's case, his mother Valerie had been his primary caregiver. The evidence suggested that Jose's fatal injuries had occurred while in her care. Moorhead police arrested Valerie Connie Zamora and charged her with second-degree murder. The charge reflects prosecutors' belief that she intentionally caused Jose's death, though perhaps without the premeditation that would be required for first-degree murder. As of the time of this recording, Valerie Zamora's case is still moving through the court system. She has been charged but not yet convicted. Under American law, she is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. She has the right to present a defense, to challenge the evidence against her, and to have her case heard by an impartial jury. However, the fact that she has been charged with second-degree murder indicates that prosecutors believe they have sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she caused Jose's death. The investigation into what happened to Jose likely involved extensive work by medical examiners, law enforcement investigators, and possibly child abuse specialists. They would have documented Jose's injuries in detail, established a timeline of events, interviewed everyone who had contact with Jose in the days and hours before his death, and examined Valerie's background and circumstances. Medical evidence in cases involving young children is particularly important. Medical examiners can often determine not just how a child was harmed, but approximately when the injuries occurred and whether they could have been accidental. They can distinguish between injuries from falls or normal childhood accidents and injuries from intentional harm. If Jose's case goes to trial, the jury will hear this medical evidence along with all the other evidence prosecutors have gathered. They will hear from medical experts who can explain what Jose's injuries indicate. They will hear from investigators who can describe what they discovered during their investigation. They may hear from people who knew Valerie and can speak to her circumstances and state of mind. The defense will have the opportunity to present their own evidence and challenge the prosecution's case. They may argue that Jose's injuries were accidental, or that Valerie was experiencing severe mental health issues that affected her judgment, or that there is reasonable doubt about what happened. Ultimately, a jury will decide whether Valerie Zamora is guilty of taking Jose's life. Whatever the outcome of the trial, one fact remains unchanged. Jose Lazarus Zamora is gone. At 20 months old, his life ended. His potential will never be realized. His mother will never get to see what kind of person he would have become. The Moorhead community has mourned Jose's passing. Vigils have been held. Child advocacy organizations have used the case to discuss the importance of recognizing warning signs of families in distress and providing support before tragedy occurs. These conversations are valuable. Every community needs to think about how to better support struggling parents, how to reduce barriers to accessing mental health services, how to create safety nets that catch families before they fall into crisis. But conversations and policy changes, while important, can't undo what has already happened. They can only help prevent future tragedies. They can only save the next child. That's the work we must all commit to, not just remembering and mourning the children who have been lost, but actively working to protect the children who are still with us. Recognizing warning signs, offering support to struggling families, reporting concerns when we see children who might be at risk. These actions aren't easy. It's uncomfortable to report a neighbor or family member to Child Protection Services. It's difficult to offer help to someone who seems to be coping poorly with parenthood. We worry about overstepping, about being wrong, about damaging relationships. But the alternative, staying silent when a child is at risk, can have devastating consequences. If you see something concerning, speak up. Call your local child protection agency. Talk to a school counselor or a trusted professional who can assess the situation. You might be wrong. You might face some awkwardness or conflict, but you might also save a child's life. In Valerie Zamora's case, we don't yet know all the details of what happened or what warning signs, if any, might have been present before Jose's death. The full story will emerge as the case proceeds through the legal system. What we know now is that a 20-month-old boy is gone. A mother has been charged with causing his death, and a community is left to grieve and to grapple with difficult questions about how to prevent such tragedies. Jose Lazarus Zamora deserved better. He deserved a childhood. He deserved to grow up surrounded by people who would protect and nurture him. He deserved all the years that were stolen from him. As Valerie Zamora's case moves forward, Jose's brief life serves as a reminder of what's at stake in child protection work. Every case, every investigation, every intervention is about a real child with inherent worth and infinite potential. We owe it to Jose and to all the children in these cases to do better, to build stronger support systems, to respond more quickly to warning signs, to hold people accountable when they harm children, and to never stop working toward a world where every child is safe. If Jose's story moves you, if you believe his 20 months of life mattered, and that we all have a responsibility to protect vulnerable children, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Together, we can raise awareness, demand accountability, and work toward preventing future tragedies. Conclusion: Lessons from Darkness. We've journeyed through 60 years of Minnesota history, from 1965 to 2025, examining 10 cases that challenge everything we believe about motherhood, about family, and about safety. These cases span different eras, different communities, different circumstances. But certain themes emerge consistently. First, every single child in these cases was innocent and vulnerable. They ranged from infants to 6 years old. They trusted completely. They depended absolutely. And they were betrayed by the people who should have protected them above all others. Second, warning signs existed in many of these cases. Neighbors noticed concerning behavior. Medical professionals saw troubling patterns. Family members raised concerns. But those warnings weren't always heeded. Reports weren't always acted upon. Systems failed to protect children who needed protection. Third, mental illness, substance use disorders, trauma, and stress appeared as contributing factors in several cases. These are real issues that affect real families and deserve serious attention and resources. But thousands of parents struggle with these same challenges without harming their children. Contributing factors provide context, not excuse. Fourth, each of these tragedies was preventable. Different choices, better systems, more resources, earlier interventions. Any or all of these might have saved these children's lives. What do we take away from these difficult stories? We must acknowledge reality. Maternal instinct is not universal or unbreakable. The title mother doesn't automatically confer virtue. Most mothers love and protect their children fiercely, but some don't, and we must be willing to see that truth. We must strengthen systems. Child protection agencies need adequate funding, reasonable caseloads, comprehensive training, and clear protocols. Mental health services must be accessible, affordable, and stigma-free. Communities need education about recognizing warning signs and reporting concerns. We must demand accountability. When children are harmed, investigations must be thorough and prosecutions vigorous. Justice for victims matters, both as recognition of their worth and as deterrent to others who might consider harming children. We must remember the victims. Dennis Jurgens, the 6 children of Khoua Her, the unnamed infants found near the Mississippi River, the 3-month-old son of Ashleigh Casey, Eli Hart, the child who suffered under Jorden Borders' care, the 3-year-old daughter of Suad Ali, the children of Jennifer Stately, Larena Jackson's toddler, Jose Lazarus Zamora. These names, these lives, these stolen futures, they matter profoundly. They deserve to be remembered and honored. They deserve to have their stories told so that we learn, we grow, and we commit to doing better. Minnesota has learned painful lessons from these cases. Laws have been strengthened. Training has improved. Resources have increased. But there's always more work to do. Somewhere right now, a child is suffering. A parent is struggling and making dangerous choices. A system is missing warning signs. The next tragedy is forming. But the next tragedy can be prevented. The next child can be saved. If we pay attention. If we speak up. If we demand that children's safety is our highest priority. These 10 cases represent 10 failures. Failures to protect. Failures to intervene. Failures to recognize danger. We cannot undo these tragedies. We cannot bring these children back. But we can honor their memory by committing to do better. To see more clearly. To act more decisively. To protect more effectively. That's the legacy these children deserve. That's the justice we owe them. That's the work we must all undertake. Child protection isn't someone else's job. It's everyone's responsibility. Teachers, doctors, neighbors, friends, family members. All of us play a role in keeping children safe. If you see something concerning, report it. If you know a parent who is struggling, offer support. If you work in a system that touches children's lives, advocate for better resources and policies. If you have the power to vote or to influence policy, use it to prioritize children's welfare. These actions matter. They save lives. They prevent tragedies. They create a world where fewer children suffer and more children thrive. Thank you for watching this episode of Cold Case Hour. These stories aren't easy to tell or to hear, but they're important. They matter. These children matter. As long as children are being harmed, we will keep telling their stories, demanding justice, and working toward prevention. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, if you think these children deserve to be remembered and honored, make sure you subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your commitment to child protection. And most importantly, if you ever suspect a child is being harmed, don't stay silent. Make the call. File the report. Offer help. You might save a life. We all have a role to play in protecting vulnerable children. Let's commit to playing that role with awareness, courage, and compassion. Until next time, stay vigilant. Stay compassionate. This has been Cold Case Hour. These cases will never be closed in our hearts. These children will never be forgotten. Subscribe now and join us as we continue to bring attention to cases that matter, victims who deserve justice, and reforms that save lives.